Today, in Audiobooks for me, we are going to listen to Orlando, a biography, a 1928 novel by British writer Virginia Woolf. This book is divided into 4 videos. This is Part 2. We hope you enjoy it. Here, Orlando, who usually took such things for granted, was, for the first time, unaccountably ashamed of the number of his servants and of the splendour of his table. Stranger still, he bethought him with pride, for the thought was generally distasteful, of that great-grandmother Moll who had milked the cows. He was about somehow to allude to this humble woman and her milk pails, when the poet forestalled him by saying that it was odd, seeing how common the name of Green was, that the family had come over with the Conqueror and was of the highest nobility in France. Unfortunately, they had come down in the world and done little more than leave their name to the royal borough of Greenwich. Further talk of the same sort, about lost castles, coats of arms, cousins who were baronets in the north, intermarriage with noble families in the west, how some Greens spelt the name with an E at the end, and others without, lasted till the venison was on the table. Then Orlando contrived to say something of Grandmother Moll and her cows, and had eased his heart a little of its burden by the time the wild fowl were before them. But it was not until the Malmsey was passing freely that Orlando dared mention what he could not help thinking a more important matter than the Greens or the cows. That is to say, the sacred subject of poetry. At the first mention of the word, the poet's eyes flashed fire. He dropped the fine gentleman airs he had worn, thumped his glass on the table, and launched into one of the longest, most intricate, most passionate, and bitterest stories that Orlando had ever heard, save from the lips of a jilted woman, about a play of his, another poet, and a critic. Of the nature of poetry itself, Orlando only gathered that it was harder to sell than prose, and though the lines were shorter, took longer in the writing. So the talk went on with ramifications interminable, until Orlando ventured to hint that he had himself been so rash as to write. But here the poet leapt from his chair. A mouse had squeaked in the wainscot, he said. The truth was, he explained, that his nerves were in a state where a mouse's squeak upset them for a fortnight. Doubtless the house was full of vermin, but Orlando had not heard them. The poet then gave Orlando the full story of his health for the past 10 years or so. It had been so bad that one could only marvel that he still lived. He had had the palsy, the gout, the ague, the dropsy, and the 3 sorts of fever in succession, added to which he had an enlarged heart, a great spleen, and a diseased liver. But above all, he had, he told Orlando, sensations in his spine which defied description. There was one knob about the 3rd from the top which burnt like fire, another about 2nd from the bottom which was cold as ice. Sometimes he woke with a brain like lead. At others, it was as if 1,000 wax tapers were alight and people were throwing fireworks inside him. He could feel a rose leaf through his mattress, he said, and knew his way almost about London by the feel of the cobbles. Altogether he was a piece of machinery so finely made and curiously put together. Here he raised his hand as if unconsciously, and indeed it was of the finest shape imaginable, that it confounded him to think that he had only sold 500 copies of his poem. But that, of course, was largely due to the conspiracy against him. All he could say, he concluded, banging his fist upon the table, was that the art of poetry was dead in England. How that could be with Shakespeare, Marlowe, Ben Jonson, Browne, Donne, all now writing or just having written, Orlando reeling off the names of his favourite heroes, could not think. Green laughed sardonically. Shakespeare, he admitted, had written some scenes that were well enough, but he had taken them chiefly from Marlowe. Marlowe was a likely boy, but what could you say of a lad who died before he was 30? As for Browne, he was for writing poetry and prose, and people soon got tired of such conceits as that. Don was a mountebank who wrapped up his lack of meaning in hard words. The gulls were taken in, but the style would be out of fashion 12 months hence. As for Ben Jonson was a friend of his and he never spoke ill of his friends. No, he concluded, the great age of literature is past. The great age of literature was the Greek. The Elizabethan age was inferior in every respect to the Greek. In such ages men cherished a divine ambition which he might call la gloire. He pronounced it glore, so that Orlando did not at first catch his meaning. Now all young writers were in the pay of the booksellers and poured out any trash that would sell. Shakespeare was the chief offender in this way, and Shakespeare was already paying the penalty. Their own age, he said, was marked by precious conceits and wild experiments, neither of which the Greeks would have tolerated for a moment. Much though it hurt him to say it, for he loved literature as he loved his life, he could see no good in the present and had no hope for the future. Here he poured himself out another glass of wine. Orlando was shocked by these doctrines, yet could not help observing that the critic himself seemed by no means downcast. On the contrary, the more he denounced his own time, the more complacent he became. He could remember, he said, a night at the Cock Tavern in Fleet Street, when Kit Marlowe was there and some others. Kit was in high feather, rather drunk, which he easily became, and in a mood to say silly things. He could see him now, brandishing his glass at the company and hiccoughing out, "Stat my vitals, Bill." This was to Shakespeare. "There's a great wave coming and you're on the top of it," by which he meant, Green explained, that they were trembling on the verge of a great age in English literature, and that Shakespeare was to be a poet of some importance. Happily for himself, he was killed 2 nights later in a drunken brawl, and so did not live to see how this prediction turned out. "Poor foolish fellow," said Green, "to go and say a thing like that. A great age, forsooth. The Elizabethan, a great age." "So, my dear lord," he continued, settling himself comfortably in his chair and rubbing the wine-glass between his fingers, "we must make the best of it, cherish the past and honour those writers, there are still a few of them, who take antiquity for their model and write, not for pay, but for glore." Orlando could have wished him a better accent. "Glore," said Green, "is the spur of noble minds. Had I a pension of £300 a year paid quarterly, I would live for glore alone. I would lie in bed every morning reading Cicero. I would imitate his style so that you couldn't tell the difference between us. That's what I call fine writing," said Green. "That's what I call glore. But it's necessary to have a pension to do it." By this time Orlando had abandoned all hope of discussing his own work with the poet. But this mattered the less as the talk now got upon the lives and characters of Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, and the rest, all of whom Green had known intimately, and about whom he had 1,000 anecdotes of the most amusing kind to tell. Orlando had never laughed so much in his life. These, then, were his gods. Half were drunken, and all were amorous. Most of them quarrelled with their wives. Not one of them was above a lie or an intrigue of the most paltry kind. Their poetry was scribbled down on the backs of washing bills held to the heads of printers' devils at the street door. Thus Hamlet went to press. Thus Lear. Thus Othello. No wonder, as Green said, that these plays show the faults they do. The rest of the time was spent in carousings and junketings in taverns and in beer gardens, when things were said that passed belief for wit, and things were done that made the utmost frolic of the courtiers seem pale in comparison. All this Green told with a spirit that roused Orlando to the highest pitch of delight. He had a power of mimicry that brought the dead to life, and could say the finest things of books provided they were written 300 years ago. So time passed, and Orlando felt for his guest a strange mixture of liking and contempt, of admiration and pity. as well as something too indefinite to be called by any one name, but had something of fear in it and something of fascination. He talked incessantly about himself, yet was such good company that one could listen to the story of his ague forever. Then he was so witty. Then he was so irreverent. Then he made so free with the names of God and woman. Then he was so full of queer crafts and had such strange lore in his head, could make salad in 300 different ways, knew all that could be known of the mixing of wines, played 6 musical instruments, and was the first person, and perhaps the last, to toast cheese in the great Italian fireplace. That he did not know a geranium from a carnation, an oak from a birch tree, a mastiff from a greyhound, a teg from a ewe, wheat from barley, ploughland from fallow, was ignorant of the rotation of the crops, thought oranges grew underground and turnips on trees, preferred any townscape to any landscape. All this and much more amazed Orlando, who had never met anybody of his kind before. Even the maids who despised him tittered at his jokes, and the men-servants who loathed him hung about to hear his stories. Indeed, the house had never been so lively as now that he was there, all of which gave Orlando a great deal to think about and caused him to compare this way of life with the old. He recalled the sort of talk he had been used to about the King of Spain's apoplexy or the mating of a bitch. He bethought him how the day passed between the stables and the dressing closet. He remembered how the lords snored over their wine and hated anybody who woke them up. He bethought him how active and valiant they were in body, how slothful and timid in mind. Worried by these thoughts and unable to strike a proper balance, he came to the conclusion that he had admitted to his house a plaguy spirit of unrest that would never suffer him to sleep sound again. At the same moment, Nick Green came to precisely the opposite conclusion. Lying in bed of a morning on the softest pillows between the smoothest sheets and looking out of his oriel window upon turf which for centuries had known neither dandelion nor dockweed, he thought that unless he could somehow make his escape, he should be smothered alive. Getting up and hearing the pigeons coo, dressing and hearing the fountains fall, he thought that unless he could hear the drays roar upon the cobbles of Fleet Street, he would never write another line. If this goes on much longer, he thought, hearing the footman mend the fire and spread the table with silver dishes next door, I shall fall asleep, and here he gave a prodigious yawn, sleeping die. So he sought Orlando in his room and explained that he had not been able to sleep a wink all night because of the silence. Indeed, the house was surrounded by a park 15 miles in circumference and a wall 10 feet high. Silence, he said, was of all things the most oppressive to his nerves. He would end his visit, by Orlando's leave, that very morning. Orlando felt some relief at this, yet also a great reluctance to let him go. The house, he thought, would seem very dull without him. On parting, for he had never yet liked to mention the subject, he had the temerity to press his play upon the death of Hercules upon the poet and ask his opinion of it. The poet took it, muttered something about Glure and Cicero, which Orlando cut short by promising to pay the pension quarterly, whereupon Green, with many protestations of affection, jumped into the coach and was gone. The great hall had never seemed so large, so splendid, or so empty as the chariot rolled away. Orlando knew that he would never have the heart to make toasted cheese in the Italian fireplace again. He would never have the wit to crack jokes about Italian pictures, never have the skill to mix punch as it should be mixed. 1,000 good quips and cranks would be lost to him. Yet what a relief to be out of the sound of that querulous voice. What a luxury to be alone once more, so he could not help reflecting, as he unloosed the mastiff which had been tied up these 6 weeks because it never saw the poet without biting him. Nick Green was set down at the corner of Fetter Lane that same afternoon and found things going on much as he had left them. Mrs. Green, that is to say, was giving birth to a baby in one room. Tom Fletcher was drinking gin in another. Books were tumbled all about the floor. Dinner, such as it was set on a dressing table where the children had been making mud pies. But this, Green felt, was the atmosphere for writing. Here he could write, and write he did. The subject was made for him. A noble lord at home. A visit to a nobleman in the country. His new poem was to have some such title as that. Seizing the pen with which his little boy was tickling the cat's ears and dipping it in the egg cup which served for inkpot, Green dashed off a very spirited satire there and then. It was so done to a turn that no one could doubt that the young lord who was roasted was Orlando. His most private sayings and doings, his enthusiasms and follies, down to the very colour of his hair and the foreign way he had of rolling his R's, were there, to the life. And if there had been any doubt about it, Green clinched the matter by introducing, with scarcely any disguise, passages from that aristocratic tragedy, The Death of Hercules, which he found, as he expected, wordy and bombastic in the extreme. The pamphlet, which ran at once into several editions and paid the expenses of Mrs. Green's 10th lying-in, was soon sent by friends who take care of such matters to Orlando himself. When he had read it, which he did with deadly composure from start to finish, he rang for the footman, delivered the document to him at the end of a pair of tongs, bade him drop it in the filthiest heart of the foulest midden on the estate. Then, when the man was turning to go, he stopped him. "Take the swiftest horse in the stable," he said. "Ride for dear life to Harwich. There embark upon a ship which you will find bound for Norway. Buy for me from the king's own kennels the finest elk hounds of the royal strain, male and female. Bring them back without delay. For," he murmured, scarcely above his breath as he turned to his books, "I have done with men." The footman, who was perfectly trained in his duties, bowed and disappeared. He fulfilled his task so efficiently that he was back that day 3 weeks, leading in his hand a leash of the finest elk hounds, one of whom, a female, gave birth that very night, under the dinner table, to a litter of 8 fine puppies. Orlando had them brought to his bedchamber. "For," he said, "I have done with men." Nevertheless, he paid the pension quarterly. Thus, at the age of 30 or thereabouts, this young nobleman had not only had every experience that life has to offer, but had seen the worthlessness of them all. Love and ambition, women and poets were all equally vain. Literature was a farce. The night after reading Green's visit to a nobleman in the country, he burnt in a great conflagration 57 poetical works, only retaining the oak tree, which was his boyish dream and very short. 2 things alone remained to him in which he now put any trust: dogs and nature, an elk-hound and a rose-bush. The world in all its variety, life in all its complexity, had shrunk to that. Dogs and a bush were the whole of it. So, feeling quit of a vast mountain of illusion, and very naked in consequence, he called his hounds to him and strode through the park. So long had he been secluded, writing and reading, that he had half forgotten the amenities of nature, which in June can be great. When he reached that high mound whence on fine days half of England with a slice of Wales and Scotland thrown in can be seen, he flung himself under his favourite oak tree and felt that if he need never speak to another man or woman so long as he lived, if his dogs did not develop the faculty of speech, if he never met a poet or a princess again, he might make out what years remained to him in tolerable content. Here he came then, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. He saw the beech trees turn golden and the young ferns unfurl. He saw the moon sickle and then circular. He saw, but probably the reader can imagine the passage which should follow, and how every tree and plant in the neighbourhood is described first green, then golden. How moons rise and suns set, how spring follows winter and autumn summer, how night succeeds day and day night, how there is first a storm and then fine weather. How things remain much as they are for 200 or 300 years or so, except for a little dust and a few cobwebs which one old woman can sweep up in half an hour. A conclusion which, one cannot help feeling, might have been reached more quickly by the simple statement that time passed. Here the exact amount could be indicated in brackets, and nothing whatever happened. But time, unfortunately, though it makes animals and vegetables bloom and fade with amazing punctuality, has no such simple effect upon the mind of man. The mind of man, moreover, works with equal strangeness upon the body of time. An hour, once it lodges in the queer element of the human spirit, may be stretched to 50 or 100 times its clock length. On the other hand, an hour may be accurately represented on the timepiece of the mind by 1 second. This extraordinary discrepancy between time on the clock and time in the mind is less known than it should be and deserves fuller investigation. But the biographer, whose interests are, as we have said, highly restricted, must confine himself to one simple statement. When a man has reached the age of 30, as Orlando now had, time when he is thinking becomes inordinately long. Time when he is doing becomes inordinately short. Thus Orlando gave his orders and did the business of his vast estates in a flash. But directly he was alone on the mound under the oak tree, the seconds began to round and fill, until it seemed as if they would never fall. They filled themselves, moreover, with the strangest variety of objects. For not only did he find himself confronted by problems which have puzzled the wisest of men, such as what is love? What friendship? What truth? But directly he came to think about them, his whole past, which seemed to him of extreme length and variety, rushed into the falling second, swelled it a dozen times its natural size, coloured it 1,000 tints, and filled it with all the odds and ends in the universe. In such thinking, or by whatever name it should be called, he spent months and years of his life. It would be no exaggeration to say that he would go out after breakfast a man of 30 and come home to dinner a man of 55 at least. Some weeks added a century to his age, others no more than 3 seconds at most. Altogether, the task of estimating the length of human life, of the animals we presume not to speak, is beyond our capacity, for directly we say that it is ages long, we are reminded that it is briefer than the fall of a rose-leaf to the ground. Of the two forces which alternately, and what is more confusing still, at the same moment, dominate our unfortunate numbskulls, brevity and diuturnity. Orlando was sometimes under the influence of the elephant-footed deity, then of the gnat-winged fly. Life seemed to him of prodigious length, yet even so it went like a flash. But even when it stretched longest, and the moments swelled biggest, and he seemed to wander alone in deserts of vast eternity, there was no time for the smoothing out and deciphering of those scored parchments which 30 years among men and women had rolled tight in his heart and brain. Long before he had done thinking about love, the oak tree had put forth its leaves and shaken them to the ground a dozen times in the process. Ambition would jostle it off the field, to be replaced by friendship or literature. And as the first question had not been settled, what is love? Back it would come at the least provocation or none, and hustle books or metaphors of what one lives for into the margin, there to wait till they saw their chance to rush into the field again. What made the process still longer was that it was profusely illustrated, not only with pictures, as that of old Queen Elizabeth, laid on her tapestry couch in rose-coloured brocade, with an ivory snuff-box in her hand and a gold-hilted sword by her side, but with scents. She was strongly perfumed, and with sounds. The stags were barking in Richmond Park that winter's day, and so the thought of love would be all ambered over with snow and winter, with log fires burning, with Russian women, gold swords, and the bark of stags. with old King James's slobbering and fireworks and sacks of treasure in the holds of Elizabethan sailing ships. Every single thing, once he tried to dislodge it from its place in his mind, he found thus cumbered with other matter like the lump of glass, which, after a year at the bottom of the sea, is grown about with bones and dragonflies, and coins, and the tresses of drowned women. "Another metaphor, by Jupiter!" he would exclaim as he said this, which will show the disorderly and circuitous way in which his mind worked and explain why the oak tree flowered and faded so often before he came to any conclusion about love. And what's the point of it? He would ask himself. Why not say simply in so many words? And then he would try to think for half an hour. Or was it 2 years and a half? How to say simply in so many words what love is. A figure like that is manifestly untruthful, he argued, for no dragonfly, unless under very exceptional circumstances, could live at the bottom of the sea. And if literature is not the bride and bedfellow of truth, what is she? Confound it all, he cried. Why say bedfellow when one's already said bride? Why not simply say what one means and leave it? So then he tried saying the grass is green and the sky is blue, and so to propitiate the austere spirit of poetry, whom still, though at a great distance, he could not help reverencing. The sky is blue, he said. The grass is green. Looking up, he saw that, on the contrary, the sky is like the veils which 1,000 Madonnas have let fall from their hair, and the grass fleets and darkens like a flight of girls fleeing the embraces of hairy satyrs from enchanted woods. Upon my word, he said, for he had fallen into the bad habit of speaking aloud, I don't see that one's more true than another. Both are utterly false. And he despaired of being able to solve the problem of what poetry is and what truth is, and fell into a deep dejection. And here we may profit by a pause in his soliloquy to reflect how odd it was to see Orlando stretched there on his elbow on a June day, and to reflect that this fine fellow with all his faculties about him and a healthy body, witness cheeks and limbs, a man who never thought twice about heading a charge or fighting a duel, should be so subject to the lethargy of thought and rendered so susceptible by it that when it came to a question of poetry, or his own competence in it, he was as shy as a little girl behind her mother's cottage door. In our belief, Green's ridicule of his tragedy hurt him as much as the princess' ridicule of his love. But to return. Orlando went on thinking. He kept looking at the grass and at the sky and trying to bethink him what a true poet, who has his verses published in London, would say about them. Memory, meanwhile, whose habits have already been described, kept steady before his eyes the face of Nicholas Green, as if that sardonic, loose-lipped man, treacherous as he had proved himself, were the muse in person. And it was to him that Orlando must do homage. So Orlando, that summer morning, offered him a variety of phrases, some plain, others figured. And Nick Green kept shaking his head and sneering and muttering something about Glore and Cicero and the death of poetry in our time. At length, starting to his feet, it was now winter and very cold, Orlando swore one of the most remarkable oaths of his lifetime, for it bound him to a servitude than which none is stricter. "I'll be blasted," he said, "if I ever write another word, or try to write another word, to please Nick Green or the Muse. Bad, good, or indifferent, I'll write from this day forward. To please myself." And here he made as if he were tearing a whole budget of papers across and tossing them in the face of that sneering, loose-lipped man. Upon which, as a cur ducks if you stoop to shy a stone at him, Memory ducked her effigy of Nick Green out of sight, and substituted for it nothing whatever. But Orlando, all the same, went on thinking. He had indeed much to think of. For when he tore the parchment across, he tore, in one rending, the scrolloping emblazoned scroll which he had made out in his own favour in the solitude of his room, appointing himself as the king appoints ambassadors, the first poet of his race, the first writer of his age, conferring eternal immortality upon his soul and granting his body a grave among laurels and the intangible banners of a people's reverence perpetually. Eloquent as this all was, he now tore it up and threw it in the dustbin. "Fame," he said, "is like." And since there was no Nick Green to stop him, he went on to revel in images of which we will choose only one or two of the quietest. A braided coat which hampers the limbs, a jacket of silver which curbs the heart, a painted shield which covers a scarecrow, etc., etc. The pith of his phrases was that while fame impedes and constricts, obscurity wraps about a man like a mist. Obscurity is dark, ample, and free. Obscurity lets the mind take its way unimpeded. Over the obscure man is poured the merciful suffusion of darkness. None knows where he goes or comes. He may seek the truth and speak it. He alone is free. He alone is truthful. He alone is at peace. And so he sank into a quiet mood under the oak tree, the hardness of whose roots exposed above the ground seemed to him rather comfortable than otherwise. Sunk for a long time in profound thoughts as to the value of obscurity and the delight of having no name, but being like a wave which returns to the deep body of the sea, thinking how obscurity rids the mind of the irk of envy and spite, how it sets running in the veins the free waters of generosity and magnanimity, and allows giving and taking without thanks offered or praise given, which must have been the way of all great poets, he supposed, though his knowledge of Greek was not enough to bear him out, for he thought Shakespeare must have written like that, and the church builders built like that, anonymously, needing no thanking or naming, but only their work in the daytime, and a little ale, perhaps, at night. What an admirable life this is, he thought, stretching his limbs out under the oak tree. And why not enjoy it this very moment? The thought struck him like a bullet. Ambition dropped like a plummet. Rid of the heartburn of rejected love, and of vanity rebuked, and all the other stings and pricks which the nettle-bed of life had burnt upon him when ambitious of fame, but could no longer inflict upon one careless of glory, he opened his eyes, which had been wide open all the time, but had seen only thoughts, and saw, lying in the hollow beneath him, his house. There it lay in the early sunshine of spring. It looked a town rather than a house, but a town built not hither and thither, as this man wished or that, but circumspectly, by a single architect with one idea in his head. Courts and buildings, grey, red, plum colour, lay orderly and symmetrical. The courts were some of them oblong and some square. In this was a fountain, in that a statue. The buildings were some of them low, some pointed. Here was a chapel, there a belfry. Spaces of the greenest grass lay in between, and clumps of cedar trees and beds of bright flowers. All were clasped, yet so well set out was it that it seemed that every part had room to spread itself fittingly by the roll of a massive wall, while smoke from innumerable chimneys curled perpetually into the air. This vast yet ordered building, which could house 1,000 men and perhaps 2,000 horses, was built, Orlando thought, by workmen whose names are unknown. Here have lived, for more centuries than I can count, the obscure generations of my own obscure family. Not one of these Richards, Johns, Annes, Elizabeths has left a token of himself behind him, yet all, working together with their spades and their needles, their love-making and their childbearing, have left this. Never had the house looked more noble and humane. Why then had he wished to raise himself above them? For it seemed vain and arrogant in the extreme to try to better that anonymous work of creation, the labours of those vanished hands. Better was it to go unknown and leave behind you an arch, a potting shed, a wall where peaches ripen, than to burn like a meteor and leave no dust, For after all, he said, kindling as he looked at the great house on the greensward below, the unknown lords and ladies who lived there never forgot to set aside something for those who come after, for the roof that will leak, for the tree that will fall. There was always a warm corner for the old shepherd in the kitchen, always food for the hungry, always their goblets were polished, though they lay sick, and their windows were lit, though they lay dying. Lords though they were content to go down into obscurity with the mole-catcher and the stone mason. Obscure noblemen, forgotten builders. Thus he apostrophized them with a warmth that entirely gainsaid such critics as called him cold, indifferent, slothful. The truth being that equality often lies just on the other side of the wall from where we seek it. Thus he apostrophized his house and race in terms of the most moving eloquence. But when it came to the peroration, and what is eloquence that lacks a peroration? He fumbled. He would have liked to have ended with a flourish to the effect that he would follow in their footsteps and add another stone to their building. Since, however, the building already covered 9 acres, to add even a single stone seemed superfluous. Could one mention furniture in a peroration? Could one speak of chairs and tables and mats to lie beside people's beds? For whatever the peroration wanted, that was what the house stood in need of. Leaving his speech unfinished for the moment, he strode downhill again, resolved henceforward to devote himself to the furnishing of the mansion. The news that she was to attend him instantly brought tears to the eyes of good old Mrs. Grimsditch, now grown somewhat old. Together they perambulated the house, the towel-horse in the king's bedroom, and that was King Jamie, my lord, she said, hinting that it was many a day since a king had slept under their roof. But the odious Parliament days were over, and there was now a crown in England again. Lacked a leg. There were no stands to the ewers in the little closet leading into the waiting-room of the Duchess's page. Mr. Green had made a stain on the carpet with his nasty pipe smoking, which she and Judy, for all their scrubbing, had never been able to wash out. Indeed, when Orlando came to reckon up the matter of furnishing with rosewood chairs and cedarwood cabinets, with silver basins, china bowls, and Persian carpets, every one of the 365 bedrooms which the house contained, he saw that it would be no light one, and if some thousands of pounds of his estate remained over, these would do little more than hang a few galleries with tapestry, set the dining hall with fine carved chairs, and provide mirrors of solid silver, and chairs of the same metal, for which he had an inordinate passion, for the furnishing of the royal bedchambers. He now set to work in earnest, as we can prove beyond a doubt if we look at his ledgers. Let us glance at an inventory of what he bought at this time, with the expenses totted up in the margin. But these we omit. To 50 pairs of Spanish blankets, ditto curtains of crimson and white taffeta, the valance to them of white satin embroidered with crimson and white silk. To 70 yellow satin chairs and 60 stools, suitable with their buckram covers to them all. To 67 walnut tree tables. To 17 dozen boxes containing each dozen 5 dozen of Venice glasses. To 102 mats, each 30 yards long. To 97 cushions of crimson damask, laid with silver parchment lace, and footstools of cloth of tissue and chairs suitable. To 50 branches for a dozen lights apiece. Already, it is an effect lists have upon us, we are beginning to yawn. But if we stop, it is only that the catalogue is tedious, not that it is finished. There are 99 pages more of it, and the total sum disbursed ran into many thousands, that is to say millions of our money. And if his day was spent like this, at night again, Lord Orlando might be found reckoning out what it would cost to level 1,000,000 molehills if the men were paid 10p an hour. And again, how many hundredweight of nails at 5p halfpenny a gill were needed to repair the fence round the park, which was 15 miles in circumference? And so on and so on. The tale, we say, is tedious, for one cupboard is much like another, and one molehill not much different from 1,000,000. Some pleasant journeys it cost him, and some fine adventures. As, for instance, when he set a whole city of blind women near Bruges to stitch hangings for a silver canopied bed, and the story of his adventure with a Moor in Venice of whom he bought, but only at the sword's point, his lacquered cabinet, might in other hands prove worth the telling. Nor did the work lack variety, for here would come, drawn by teams from Sussex, great trees to be sawn across and laid along the gallery for flooring, and then a chest from Persia, stuffed with wool and sawdust, from which at last he would take a single plate or one topaz ring. At length, however, there was no room in the galleries for another table, no room on the tables for another cabinet, no room in the cabinet for another rose bowl, no room in the bowl for another handful of potpourri. There was no room for anything anywhere. In short, the house was furnished. In the garden, snowdrops, crocuses, hyacinths, magnolias, roses, lilies, asters, the dahlia in all its varieties, pear trees and apple trees and cherry trees and mulberry trees, with an enormous quantity of rare and flowering shrubs, of trees evergreen and perennial, grew so thick on each other's roots that there was no plot of earth without its bloom, and no stretch of sward without its shade. In addition, he had imported wildfowl with gay plumage, and 2 Malay bears, the surliness of whose manners concealed, he was certain, trusty hearts. All now was ready, and when it was evening and the innumerable silver sconces were lit, and the light airs which forever moved about the galleries stirred the blue and green arras, so that it looked as if the huntsmen were riding and Daphne flying, when the silver shone and lacquer glowed and wood kindled, when the carved chairs held their arms out, and dolphins swam upon the walls with mermaids on their backs, when all this, and much more than all this, was complete and to his liking, Orlando walked through the house with his elk hounds following and felt content. He had matter now, he thought, to fill out his peroration. Perhaps it would be well to begin the speech all over again. Yet, as he paraded the galleries, he felt that still something was lacking. Chairs and tables, however richly gilt and carved, sofas resting on lions' paws with swans' necks curving under them, beds even of the softest swansdown, are not by themselves enough. People sitting in them, people lying in them, improve them amazingly. Accordingly, Orlando now began a series of very splendid entertainments to the nobility and gentry of the neighbourhood. The 365 bedrooms were full for a month at a time. Guests jostled each other on the 52 staircases. 300 servants bustled about the pantries. Banquets took place almost nightly. Thus, in a very few years, Orlando had worn the nap off his velvet and spent the half of his fortune, but he had earned the good opinion of his neighbours, held a score of offices in the county, and was annually presented with perhaps a dozen volumes dedicated to his lordship in rather fulsome terms by grateful poets. For though he was careful not to consort with writers at that time, and kept himself always aloof from ladies of foreign blood, still he was excessively generous both to women and to poets, and both adored him. But when the feasting was at its height, and his guests were at their revels, he was apt to take himself off to his private room alone. There, when the door was shut, and he was certain of privacy, he would have out an old writing book, stitched together with silk stolen from his mother's workbox, and labelled in a round schoolboy hand, "The Oak Tree, a Poem." In this he would write till midnight chimed and long after. But as he scratched out as many lines as he wrote in, the sum of them was often at the end of the year rather less than at the beginning, and it looked as if in the process of writing the poem would be completely unwritten. For it is for the historian of letters to remark that he had changed his style amazingly. His floridity was chastened, his abundance curbed. The age of prose was congealing those warm fountains. The very landscape outside was less stuck about with garlands, and the briars themselves were less thorned and intricate. Perhaps the senses were a little duller and honey and cream less seductive to the palate. Also that the streets were better drained and the houses better lit had its effect upon the style. It cannot be doubted. One day he was adding a line or two with enormous labour to the oak tree, a poem, when a shadow crossed the tail of his eye. It was no shadow he soon saw, but the figure of a very tall lady in riding hood and mantle, crossing the quadrangle on which his room looked out. As this was the most private of the courts, and the lady was a stranger to him, Orlando marvelled how she had got there. 3 days later the same apparition appeared again, and on Wednesday noon appeared once more. This time Orlando was determined to follow her, nor apparently was she afraid to be found, for she slackened her steps as he came up and looked him full in the face. Any other woman thus caught in a lord's private grounds would have been afraid. Any other woman with that face, headdress, and aspect would have thrown her mantilla across her shoulders to hide it. For this lady resembled nothing so much as a hare startled but obdurate, a hare whose timidity is overcome by an immense and foolish audacity, a hare that sits upright and glowers at its pursuer with great bulging eyes, with ears erect but quivering, with nose pointed but twitching. This hare, moreover, was 6 feet high, and wore a headdress, into the bargain of some antiquated kind, which made her look still taller. Thus confronted, she stared at Orlando with a stare in which timidity and audacity were most strangely combined. First, she asked him with a proper but somewhat clumsy curtsy to forgive her intrusion. Then, rising to her full height again, which must have been something over 6 feet too, she went on to say, but with such a cackle of nervous laughter, so much tee-heeing and haw-hawing, that Orlando thought she must have escaped from a lunatic asylum, that she was the Archduchess Harriet Griselda of Finster-Aarhorn and Scandop-Boom in the Romanian territory. She desired above all things to make his acquaintance, she said. She had taken lodging over a baker's shop at the park gates. She had seen his picture, and it was the image of a sister of hers who was, here she guffawed, long since dead. She was visiting the English court. The Queen was her cousin. The King was a very good fellow, but seldom went to bed sober. Here she tee-heed and haw-hawed again. In short, there was nothing for it but to ask her in and give her a glass of wine. Indoors, her manners regained the hauteur natural to a Romanian archduchess, and had she not shown a knowledge of wines rare in a lady, and made some observations upon firearms and the customs of sportsmen in her country, which were sensible enough, the talk would have lacked spontaneity. Jumping to her feet at last, she announced that she would call the following day, swept another prodigious curtsy, and departed. The following day Orlando rode out. The next, he turned his back. On the third, he drew his curtain. On the fourth it rained, and as he could not keep a lady in the wet, nor was altogether averse to company, he invited her in and asked her opinion whether a suit of armour, which belonged to an ancestor of his, was the work of Jacobi, or of Top. He inclined to Top. She held another opinion. It matters very little which. But it is of some importance to the course of our story that, in illustrating her argument, which had to do with the working of the tie-pieces, the Archduchess Harriet took the golden shin-case and fitted it to Orlando's leg. That he had a pair of the shapliest legs that any nobleman has ever stood upright upon has already been said. Perhaps something in the way she fastened the ankle-buckle, or her stooping posture, or Orlando's long seclusion, or the natural sympathy which is between the sexes, or the burgundy, or the fire. Any of these causes may have been to blame, for certainly blame there is, on one side or another, when a nobleman of Orlando's breeding, entertaining a lady in his house, and she his elder by many years, with a face a yard long and staring eyes, dressed somewhat ridiculously too, in a mantle and riding-cloak, though the season was warm, blame there is when such a nobleman is so suddenly and violently overcome by passion of some sort, that he has to leave the room. But what sort of passion, it may well be asked, could this be? And the answer is double-faced, as love herself. For love, but leaving love out of the argument for a moment, the actual event was this. When the Archduchess Harriet Griselda stooped to fasten the buckle, Orlando heard suddenly and unaccountably, far off the beating of love's wings. The distant stir of that soft plumage roused in him 1,000 memories of rushing waters, of loveliness in the snow and faithlessness in the flood. And the sound came nearer, and he blushed and trembled, and he was moved as he had thought never to be moved again, and he was ready to raise his hands and let the bird of beauty alight upon his shoulders when, horror, a creaking sound, like that the crows make tumbling over the trees, began to reverberate. The air seemed dark with coarse black wings. Voices croaked. Bits of straw, twigs and feathers dropped, and there pitched down upon his shoulders the heaviest and foulest of the birds, which is the vulture. Thus he rushed from the room and sent the footman to see the Archduchess Harriet to her carriage. For love, to which we may now return, has two faces, one white, the other black, two bodies, one smooth, the other hairy. It has 2 hands, 2 feet, 2 nails, 2, indeed, of every member, and each one is the exact opposite of the other. Yet so strictly are they joined together that you cannot separate them. In this case, Orlando's love began her flight towards him with her white face turned, and her smooth and lovely body outwards. Nearer and nearer she came, wafting before her airs of pure delight. All of a sudden, at the sight of the Archduchess presumably, she wheeled about, turned the other way round, showed herself black, hairy, brutish. And it was Lust, the vulture, not Love, the bird of paradise, that flopped foully and disgustingly upon his shoulders. Hence he ran. Hence he fetched the footman. But the harpy is not so easily banished as all that. Not only did the Archduchess continue to lodge at the baker's, but Orlando was haunted every day and night by phantoms of the foulest kind. Vainly, it seemed, had he furnished his house with silver and hung the walls with arras, when at any moment a dung-bedraggled fowl could settle upon his writing-table. There she was, flopping about among the chairs. He saw her waddling ungracefully across the galleries. Now she perched, top-heavy upon a fire-screen. When he chased her out, back she came and pecked at the glass till she broke it. Thus, realizing that his home was uninhabitable and that steps must be taken to end the matter instantly, he did what any other young man would have done in his place, and asked King Charles to send him as Ambassador Extraordinary to Constantinople. The king was walking in Whitehall. Nell Gwynn was on his arm. She was pelting him with hazel nuts. 'Twas 1,000 pities, that amorous lady sighed, that such a pair of legs should leave the country. Howbeit, the fates were hard. She could do no more than toss one kiss over her shoulder before Orlando sailed. Chapter 3. It is, indeed, highly unfortunate, and much to be regretted that at this stage of Orlando's career, when he played a most important part in the public life of his country, we have least information to go upon. We know that he discharged his duties to admiration, witness his bath, and his dukedom. We know that he had a finger in some of the most delicate negotiations between King Charles and the Turks. To that, treaties in the vault of the Record Office bear testimony. But the revolution which broke out during his period of office, and the fire which followed, have so damaged or destroyed all those papers from which any trustworthy record could be drawn, that what we can give is lamentably incomplete. Often the paper was scorched a deep brown in the middle of the most important sentence. Just when we thought to elucidate a secret that has puzzled historians for 100 years, there was a hole in the manuscript big enough to put your finger through. We have done our best to piece out a meagre summary from the charred fragments that remain, but often it has been necessary to speculate, to surmise, and even to use the imagination. Orlando's day was passed, it would seem, somewhat in this fashion. About 7 he would rise, wrap himself in a long Turkish cloak, light a cheroot, and lean his elbows on the parapet. Thus he would stand, gazing at the city beneath him, apparently entranced. At this hour the mist would lie so thick that the domes of Santa Sofia and the rest would seem to be afloat. Gradually the mist would uncover them. The bubbles would be seen to be firmly fixed. There would be the river. There the Galata Bridge. There the green-turbaned pilgrims without eyes or noses, begging alms. There the pariah dogs picking up offal. There the shawled women. There the innumerable donkeys. There men on horses carrying long poles. Soon the whole town would be astir with the cracking of whips, the beating of gongs, cryings to prayer, lashing of mules and rattle of brass-bound wheels, while sour odours made from bread fermenting and incense and spice rose even to the heights of Pera itself and seemed the very breath of the strident, multicoloured and barbaric population. Nothing, he reflected, gazing at the view which was now sparkling in the sun, could well be less like the counties of Surrey and Kent, or the towns of London and Tunbridge Wells. To the right and left rose in bald and stony prominence the inhospitable Asian mountains, to which the arid castle of a robber chief or two might hang, but parsonage there was none, nor manor house, nor cottage, nor oak, elm, violet, ivy, or wild eglantine. There were no hedges for ferns to grow on, and no fields for sheep to graze. The houses were white as eggshells and as bald. That he, who was English root and fibre, should yet exult to the depths of his heart in this wild panorama, and gaze at those passes and far heights, planning journeys there alone on foot, where only the goat and shepherd had gone before. Should feel a passion of affection for the bright, unseasonable flowers, love the unkempt pariah dogs beyond even his elk hounds at home, and snuff the acrid, sharp smell of the streets eagerly into his nostrils, surprised him. He wondered if, in the season of the Crusades, one of his ancestors had taken up with a Circassian peasant woman, thought it possible, fancied a certain darkness in his complexion, and, going indoors again, withdrew to his bath. An hour later, properly scented, curled and anointed, he would receive visits from secretaries and other high officials carrying one after another red boxes which yielded only to his own golden key. Within were papers of the highest importance, of which only fragments, here a flourish, there a seal firmly attached to a piece of burnt silk, now remain. Of their contents, then, we cannot speak, but can only testify that Orlando was kept busy. What with his wax and seals, his various coloured ribbons which had to be diversely attached, his engrossing of titles and making of flourishes round capital letters, till luncheon came, a splendid meal of perhaps 30 courses. After luncheon, lackeys announced that his coach and 6 was at the door, and he went, preceded by purple janissaries running on foot and waving great ostrich feather fans above their heads, to call upon the other ambassadors and dignitaries of state. The ceremony was always the same. On reaching the courtyard, the janissaries struck with their fans upon the main portal, which immediately flew open, revealing a large chamber, splendidly furnished. Here were seated 2 figures, generally of the opposite sexes. Profound bows and curtsies were exchanged. In the first room, it was permissible only to mention the weather. Having said that it was fine or wet, hot or cold, the ambassador then passed on to the next chamber where again 2 figures rose to greet him. Here it was only permissible to compare Constantinople as a place of residence with London, and the ambassador naturally said that he preferred Constantinople, and his hosts naturally said, though they had not seen it, that they preferred London. In the next chamber, King Charles's and the Sultan's healths had to be discussed at some length. In the next were discussed the ambassador's health and that of his host's wife, but more briefly. In the next, The ambassador complimented his host upon his furniture, and the host complimented the ambassador upon his dress. In the next, sweetmeats were offered, the host deploring their badness, the ambassador extolling their goodness. The ceremony ended at length with the smoking of a hookah and the drinking of a glass of coffee. But though the motions of smoking and drinking were gone through punctiliously, there was neither tobacco in the pipe nor coffee in the glass, as had either smoke or drink been real, the human frame would have sunk beneath the surfeit. For no sooner had the ambassador dispatched one such visit than another had to be undertaken. The same ceremonies were gone through in precisely the same order 6 or 7 times over at the houses of the other great officials, so that it was often late at night before the ambassador reached home. Though Orlando performed these tasks to admiration, and never denied that they are, perhaps, the most important part of a diplomatist's duties, he was undoubtedly fatigued by them, and often depressed to such a pitch of gloom that he preferred to take his dinner alone with his dogs. To them, indeed, he might be heard talking in his own tongue, and sometimes, it is said, he would pass out of his own gates late at night so disguised that the sentries did not know him. Then he would mingle with the crowd on the Galata Bridge, or stroll through the bazaars, or throw aside his shoes and join the worshippers in the mosques. Once, when it was given out that he was ill of a fever, shepherds bringing their goats to market reported that they had met an English lord on the mountain top and heard him praying to his God. This was thought to be Orlando himself, and his prayer was, no doubt, a poem said aloud, for it was known that he still carried about with him, in the bosom of his cloak, a much-scored manuscript. And servants, listening at the door, heard the ambassador chanting something in an odd sing-song voice when he was alone. It is with fragments such as these that we must do our best to make up a picture of Orlando's life and character at this time. There exist, even to this day, rumours, legends, anecdotes of a floating and unauthenticated kind about Orlando's life in Constantinople. We have quoted but a few of them, which go to prove that he possessed, now that he was in the prime of life, the power to stir the fancy and rivet the eye, which will keep a memory green long after all that more durable qualities can do to preserve it is forgotten. The power is a mysterious one, compounded of beauty, birth, and some rarer gift which we may call glamour, and have done with it. 1,000,000 candles, as Sasha had said, burnt in him without his being at the trouble of lighting a single one. He moved like a stag, without any need to think about his legs. He spoke in his ordinary voice, and echo beat a silver gong. Hence rumours gathered round him. He became the adored of many women and some men. It was not necessary that they should speak to him, or even that they should see him. They conjured up before them, especially when the scenery was romantic, or the sun was setting, the figure of a noble gentleman in silk stockings. Upon the poor and uneducated, he had the same power as upon the rich. Shepherds, gypsies, donkey drivers still sing songs about the English lord who dropped his emeralds in the well, which undoubtedly refer to Orlando, who once, it seems, tore his jewels from him in a moment of rage or intoxication and flung them in a fountain, whence they were fished by a page boy. But this romantic power, it is well known, is often associated with a nature of extreme reserve. Orlando seems to have made no friends. As far as is known, he formed no attachments. A certain great lady came all the way from England in order to be near him, and pestered him with her attentions, but he continued to discharge his duties so indefatigably that he had not been ambassador at the Horn for more than 2 years and a half before King Charles signified his intention of raising him to the highest rank in the peerage. The envious said that this was Nell Gwyn's tribute to the memory of a leg. But, as she had seen him once only, and was then busily engaged in pelting her royal master with nutshells, it is likely that it was his merits that won him his dukedom, not his calves. Here we must pause, for we have reached a moment of great significance in his career. For the conferring of the dukedom was the occasion of a very famous, and indeed much disputed incident, which we must now describe, picking our way among burnt papers and little bits of tape as best we may. It was at the end of the great fast of Ramadan that the Order of the Bath and the Patent of Nobility arrived in a frigate commanded by Sir Adrian Scrope, and Orlando made this the occasion for an entertainment more splendid than any that has been known before or since in Constantinople. The night was fine, the crowd immense, and the windows of the embassy brilliantly illuminated. Again, details are lacking, for the fire had its way with all such records, and has left only tantalizing fragments which leave the most important points obscure. From the diary of John Fenner Brigg, however, an English naval officer who was among the guests, we gather that people of all nationalities were packed like herrings in a barrel in the courtyard. The crowd pressed so unpleasantly close that Brigg soon climbed into a Judas tree, the better to observe the proceedings. The rumour had got about among the natives, and here is additional proof of Orlando's mysterious power over the imagination, that some kind of miracle was to be performed. Thus, writes Brigg, but his manuscript is full of burns and holes, some sentences being quite illegible. When the rockets began to soar into the air, there was considerable uneasiness among us, lest the native population should be seized, fraught with unpleasant consequences to all. English ladies in the company, I own that my hand went to my cutlass. Happily, he continues in his somewhat long-winded style, these fears seemed for the moment groundless, and, observing the demeanour of the natives, I came to the conclusion that this demonstration of our skill in the art of pyrotechny was valuable, if only because it impressed upon them the superiority of the British. Indeed, the sight was one of indescribable magnificence. I found myself alternately praising the Lord that he had permitted, and wishing that my poor dear mother, by the ambassador's orders, the long windows, which are so imposing a feature of Eastern architecture, for though ignorant in many ways, were thrown wide, and within we could see a tableau vivant or theatrical display in which English ladies and gentlemen represented a masque the work of one. The words were inaudible, but the sight of so many of our countrymen and women, dressed with the highest elegance and distinction, moved me to emotions of which I am certainly not ashamed, though unable. I was intent upon observing the astonishing conduct of Lady, which was of a nature to fasten the eyes of all upon her, and to bring discredit upon her sex and country, when, unfortunately, a branch of the Judas tree broke. Lieutenant Brigg fell to the ground, and the rest of the entry records only his gratitude to Providence, who plays a very large part in the diary, and the exact nature of his injuries. Happily, Miss Penelope Hartop, daughter of the general of that name, saw the scene from inside and carries on the tale in a letter, much defaced too, which ultimately reached a female friend at Tunbridge Wells. Miss Penelope was no less lavish in her enthusiasm than the gallant officer. Ravishing, she exclaims 10 times on one page, wondrous, utterly beyond description. Gold plate, candelabras, negroes in plush breeches, pyramids of ice, fountains of negus, jellies made to represent His Majesty's ships, swans made to represent water lilies, birds in golden cages, gentlemen in slashed crimson velvet, ladies' headdresses, at least 6 foot high, and musical boxes. Mr. Peregrine said I looked quite lovely, which I only repeat to you, my dearest, because I know, oh, how I longed for you all, surpassing anything we have seen at the Pantiles. Oceans to drink. Some gentlemen overcome. Lady Betty ravishing. Poor Lady Bonham made the unfortunate mistake of sitting down without a chair beneath her. Gentlemen all very gallant. Wished 1,000 times for you and dearest Betsy. But the sight of all others, the cynosure of all eyes. As all admitted, for none could be so vile as to deny it, was the ambassador himself. Such a leg, such a countenance, such princely manners. To see him come into the room, to see him go out again. And something interesting in the expression, which makes one feel, one scarcely knows why, that he has suffered. They say a lady was the cause of it, the heartless monster. How can one of our reputed tender sex have had the effrontery? He is unmarried, and half the ladies in the place are wild for love of him. 1,000 kisses to Tom, Jerry, Peter, and dearest Mew, presumably her cat. From the Gazette of the time we gather that as the clock struck 12, the ambassador appeared on the centre balcony, which was hung with priceless rugs. 6 Turks of the imperial bodyguard, each over 6 foot in height, held torches to his right and left. Rockets rose into the air at his appearance, and a great shout went up from the people, which the ambassador acknowledged, bowing deeply and speaking a few words of thanks in the Turkish language, which it was one of his accomplishments to speak with fluency. Next, Sir Adrian Scrope, in the full dress of a British admiral, advanced. The ambassador knelt on one knee. The admiral placed the collar of the most noble order of the Bath round his neck, then pinned the star to his breast, after which another gentleman of the diplomatic corps, advancing in a stately manner, placed on his shoulders the ducal robes and handed him on a crimson cushion the ducal coronet. At length, with a gesture of extraordinary majesty and grace, first bowing profoundly, then raising himself proudly erect, Orlando took the golden circlet of strawberry leaves and placed it, with a gesture which none that saw it ever forgot, upon his brows. It was at this point that the first disturbance began. Either the people had expected a miracle, some say a shower of gold was prophesied to fall from the skies, which did not happen, or this was the signal chosen for the attack to begin. Nobody seems to know. But as the coronet settled on Orlando's brows, a great uproar rose. Bells began ringing. The harsh cries of the prophets were heard above the shouts of the people. Many Turks fell flat to the ground and touched the earth with their foreheads. A door burst open. The natives pressed into the banqueting rooms. Women shrieked. A certain lady who was said to be dying for love of Orlando seized a candelabra and dashed it to the ground. What might not have happened had it not been for the presence of Sir Adrian Scrope and a squad of British bluejackets, nobody can say. But the Admiral ordered the bugles to be sounded. 100 bluejackets stood instantly at attention. The disorder was quelled, and quiet, at least for the time being, fell upon the scene. So far we are on the firm, if rather narrow, ground of ascertained truth. But nobody has ever known exactly what took place later that night. The testimony of the sentries and others seems, however, to prove that the embassy was empty of company, and shut up for the night in the usual way by 2 a.m. The ambassador was seen to go to his room, still wearing the insignia of his rank, and shut the door. Some say he locked it, which was against his custom. Others maintain that they heard music of a rustic kind, such as shepherd's play, later that night in the courtyard under the ambassador's window. A washerwoman who was kept awake by toothache said that she saw a man's figure, wrapped in a cloak or dressing gown, come out upon the balcony. Then, she said, a woman, much muffled, but apparently of the peasant class, was drawn up by means of a rope which the man let down to her onto the balcony. There, the washerwoman said, they embraced passionately like lovers, and went into the room together, drawing the curtains so that no more could be seen. Next morning, the Duke, as we must now call him, was found by his secretaries sunk in profound slumber amid bedclothes that were much tumbled. The room was in some disorder, his coronet having rolled on the floor, and his cloak and garter being flung all of a heap on a chair. The table was littered with papers. No suspicion was felt at first, as the fatigues of the night had been great. But when afternoon came and he still slept, a doctor was summoned. He applied remedies which had been used on the previous occasion, plasters, nettles, emetics, etc., but without success. Orlando slept on. His secretaries then thought it their duty to examine the papers on the table. Many were scribbled over with poetry, in which frequent mention was made of an oak tree. There were also various state papers and others of a private nature concerning the management of his estates in England. But at length they came upon a document of far greater significance. It was nothing less, indeed, than a deed of marriage drawn up, signed, and witnessed between his lordship, Orlando, Knight of the Garter, etc., 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 and Rosina Pepita, a dancer, father unknown, but reputed a gypsy, mother also unknown, but reputed a seller of old iron in the marketplace over against the Galata Bridge. The secretaries looked at each other in dismay, and still Orlando slept. Morning and evening they watched him, but, save that his breathing was regular and his cheeks still flushed their habitual deep rose, he gave no sign of life. Whatever science or ingenuity could do to waken him, they did. But still he slept. On the 7th day of his trance, Thursday, May 10th, the first shot was fired of that terrible and bloody insurrection of which Lieutenant Brigg had detected the first symptoms. The Turks rose against the Sultan, set fire to the town, and put every foreigner they could find, either to the sword or to the bastinado. A few English managed to escape, but, as might have been expected, the gentlemen of the British Embassy preferred to die in defence of their red boxes, or, in extreme cases, to swallow bunches of keys rather than let them fall into the hands of the infidel. The rioters broke into Orlando's room, but, seeing him stretched to all appearances dead, they left him untouched, and only robbed him of his coronet and the robes of the garter. And now again obscurity descends, and would indeed that it were deeper. Would, we almost have it in our hearts to exclaim, that it was so deep that we could see nothing whatever through its opacity. Would that we might here take the pen and write finis to our work. Would that we might spare the reader what is to come and say to him in so many words, Orlando died and was buried. But here, alas, truth, candour, and honesty. The austere gods who keep watch and ward by the ink-pot of the biographer cry no, putting their silver trumpets to their lips, they demand in one blast, truth. And again they cry, truth. And sounding yet a third time in concert, they peal forth, the truth and nothing but the truth. At which, heaven be praised, for it affords us a breathing space, the doors gently open, as if a breath of the gentlest and holiest zephyr had wafted them apart, and three figures enter. First comes Our Lady of Purity, whose brows are bound with fillets of the whitest lamb's wool, whose hair is as an avalanche of the driven snow, and in whose hand reposes the white quill of a virgin goose. Following her, but with a statelier step, comes Our Lady of Chastity, on whose brow is set, like a turret of burning but unwasting fire, a diadem of icicles. Her eyes are pure stars, and her fingers, if they touch you, freeze you to the bone. Close behind her, sheltering indeed in the shadow of her more stately sisters, comes Our Lady of Modesty, frailest and fairest of the three, whose face is only shown as the young moon shows when it is thin and sickle-shaped and half hidden among clouds. Each advances towards the centre of the room where Orlando still lies sleeping, and with gestures at once appealing and commanding, Our Lady of Purity speaks first. I am the guardian of the sleeping fawn, the snow is dear to me, and the moon rising, and the silver sea. With my robes I cover the speckled hen's eggs, and the brindled seashell. I cover vice and poverty. On all things frail or dark or doubtful, my veil descends. Wherefore speak not, reveal not. Spare, O spare. Here the trumpets peal forth. Purity avaunt, begone purity. Then Our Lady of Chastity speaks. I am she whose touch freezes and whose glance turns to stone. I have stayed the star in its dancing, and the wave as it falls. The highest Alps are my dwelling place, and when I walk, the lightnings flash in my hair. Where my eyes fall, they kill. Rather than let Orlando wake, I will freeze him to the bone. Spare, oh spare. Hear the trumpets peal forth. Chastity avaunt, begone chastity. Then Our Lady of Modesty speaks, so low that one can hardly hear. I am she that men call modesty. Virgin I am, and ever shall be. Not for me the fruitful fields and the fertile vineyard. Increase is odious to me, and when the apples burgeon or the flocks breed, I run. I let my mantle fall. My hair covers my eyes. I do not see. Spare, oh spare. Again the trumpets peal forth. Modesty avaunt, begone modesty. With gestures of grief and lamentation, the three sisters now join hands and dance slowly, tossing their veils and singing as they go. Truth, come not out from your horrid den. Hide deeper, fearful truth. For you flaunt in the brutal gaze of the sun things that were better unknown and undone. You unveil the shameful. The dark you make clear. Hide, hide, hide. Here they make as if to cover Orlando with their draperies. The trumpets, meanwhile, still blare forth the truth, and nothing but the truth. At this the sisters try to cast their veils over the mouths of the trumpets so as to muffle them, but in vain, for now all the trumpets blare forth together. Horrid sisters, go! The sisters become distracted and wail in unison, still circling and flinging their veils up and down. It has not always been so, but men want us no longer. The women detest us. We go. I, Purity, says this, to the hen roost. I, Chastity, says this, to the still unravished heights of Surrey. I, Modesty, says this, to any cosy nook where there are ivy and curtains in plenty. For there, not here. All speak together, joining hands and making gestures of farewell and despair towards the bed where Orlando lies sleeping. Dwell still in nest and boudoir, office and law court, those who love us, those who honour us, virgins and city men, lawyers and doctors, those who prohibit, those who deny, those who reverence without knowing why, those who praise without understanding, the still very numerous, heaven be praised, tribe of the respectable, who prefer to see not, desire to know not, love the darkness. Those still worship us, and with reason, for we have given them wealth, prosperity, comfort, ease. To them we go, you we leave. Come, sisters, come. This is no place for us here. They retire in haste, waving their draperies over their heads, as if to shut out something that they dare not look upon and close the door behind them. We are therefore now left entirely alone in the room with the sleeping Orlando and the trumpeters. The trumpeters, ranging themselves side by side in order, blow one terrific blast. The truth, at which Orlando woke. He stretched himself, he rose, he stood upright in complete nakedness before us, and while the trumpets pealed, truth, truth, truth. We have no choice left but confess. He was a woman. The sound of the trumpets died away, and Orlando stood stark naked. No human being since the world began has ever looked more ravishing. His form combined in one the strength of a man and a woman's grace. As he stood there, the silver trumpets prolonged their note, as if reluctant to leave the lovely sight which their blast had called forth. And chastity, purity, and modesty, inspired no doubt by curiosity, peeped in at the door and threw a garment like a towel at the naked form which, unfortunately, fell short by several inches. Orlando looked himself up and down in a long looking-glass without showing any signs of discomposure, and went, presumably, to his bath. We may take advantage of this pause in the narrative to make certain statements. Orlando had become a woman. There is no denying it. But in every other respect, Orlando remained precisely as he had been. The change of sex, though it altered their future, did nothing whatever to alter their identity. Their faces remained, as their portraits prove, practically the same. His memory, but in future we must, for convention's sake, say her for his, and she for he. Her memory, then, went back through all the events of her past life without encountering any obstacle. Some slight haziness there may have been, as if a few dark drops had fallen into the clear pool of memory. Certain things had become a little dimmed, but that was all. The change seemed to have been accomplished painlessly and completely, and in such a way that Orlando herself showed no surprise at it. Many people, taking this into account, and holding that such a change of sex is against nature, have been at great pains to prove, 1, that Orlando had always been a woman, 2, that Orlando is at this moment a man. Let biologists and psychologists determine. It is enough for us to state the simple fact. Orlando was a man till the age of 30, when he became a woman and has remained so ever since. But let other pens treat of sex and sexuality. We quit such odious subjects as soon as we can. Orlando had now washed and dressed herself in those Turkish coats and trousers which can be worn indifferently by either sex, and was forced to consider her position. That it was precarious and embarrassing in the extreme must be the first thought of every reader who has followed her story with sympathy. Young, noble, beautiful, she had woken to find herself in a position than which we can conceive none more delicate for a young lady of rank. We should not have blamed her had she rung the bell, screamed or fainted. But Orlando showed no such signs of perturbation. All her actions were deliberate in the extreme, and might indeed have been thought to show tokens of premeditation. First, she carefully examined the papers on the table, took such as seemed to be written in poetry, and secreted them in her bosom. Next she called her Salucci hound, which had never left her bed all these days, though half famished with hunger, fed and combed him. Then stuck a pair of pistols in her belt, finally wound about her person several strings of emeralds and pearls of the finest orient which had formed part of her ambassadorial wardrobe. This done, she leant out of the window, gave one low whistle, and descended the shattered and blood-stained staircase, now strewn with the litter of waste-paper baskets, treaties, dispatches, seals, sealing-wax, etc., and so entered the courtyard. There, in the shadow of a giant fig-tree, waited an old gypsy on a donkey. He led another by the bridle. Orlando swung her leg over it, and thus, attended by a lean dog, riding a donkey, in company of a gypsy, the ambassador of Great Britain at the court of the Sultan left Constantinople. They rode for several days and nights and met with a variety of adventures, some at the hands of men, some at the hands of nature, in all of which Orlando acquitted herself with courage. Within a week they reached the high ground outside Brusa, which was then the chief camping ground of the gypsy tribe to which Orlando had allied herself. Often she had looked at those mountains from her balcony at the embassy, often had longed to be there, and to find oneself where one has longed to be always to a reflective mind gives food for thought. For some time, however, she was too well pleased with the change to spoil it by thinking. The pleasure of having no documents to seal or sign, no flourishes to make, no calls to pay, was enough. The gypsies followed the grass. When it was grazed down, on they moved again. She washed in streams if she washed at all. No boxes, red, blue, or green, were presented to her. There was not a key, let alone a golden key, in the whole camp. As for visiting, the word was unknown. She milked the goats, she collected brushwood, she stole a hen's egg now and then, but always put a coin or a pearl in place of it. She herded cattle, she stripped vines. She trod the grape. She filled the goatskin and drank from it. And when she remembered how, at about this time of day, she should have been making the motions of drinking and smoking over an empty coffee cup and a pipe which lacked tobacco, she laughed aloud, cut herself another hunch of bread, and begged for a puff from old Rustum's pipe, filled though it was with cow dung. The gypsies, with whom it is obvious that she must have been in secret communication before the revolution, seem to have looked upon her as one of themselves, which is always the highest compliment a people can pay, and her dark hair and dark complexion bore out the belief that she was, by birth, one of them, and had been snatched by an English duke from a nut tree when she was a baby, and taken to that barbarous land where people live in houses because they are too feeble and diseased to stand the open air. Thus, though in many ways inferior to them, they were willing to help her to become more like them, taught her their arts of cheese-making and basket-weaving, their science of stealing and bird-snaring, and were even prepared to consider letting her marry among them. But Orlando had contracted in England some of the customs or diseases, whatever you choose to consider them, which cannot, it seems, be expelled. One evening, when they were all sitting round the campfire and the sunset was blazing over the Thessalian hills, Orlando exclaimed, "How good to eat!" The gypsies have no word for beautiful. This is the nearest. All the young men and women burst out laughing uproariously. The sky good to eat, indeed. The elders, however, who had seen more of foreigners than they had, became suspicious. They noticed that Orlando often sat for whole hours doing nothing whatever, except look here and then there. They would come upon her on some hilltop staring straight in front of her, no matter whether the goats were grazing or straying. They began to suspect that she had other beliefs than their own, and the older men and women thought it probable that she had fallen into the clutches of the vilest and cruelest among all the gods, which is nature. Nor were they far wrong. The English disease, a love of nature, was inborn in her, and here, where nature was so much larger and more powerful than in England, she fell into its hands as she had never done before. The malady is too well known, and has been, alas, too often described to need describing afresh, save very briefly. There were mountains, there were valleys, there were streams. She climbed the mountains, roamed the valleys, sat on the banks of the streams. She likened the hills to ramparts, to the breasts of doves, and the flanks of kine. She compared the flowers to enamel, and the turf to turkey rugs worn thin. Trees were withered hags, and sheep were grey boulders. Everything, in fact, was something else. She found the tarn on the mountain top, and almost threw herself in to seek the wisdom she thought lay hid there, and when, from the mountain top, she beheld far off, across the Sea of Marmara, the plains of Greece, and made out, her eyes were admirable, the Acropolis with a white streak or two, which must, she thought, be the Parthenon. Her soul expanded with her eyeballs, and she prayed that she might share the majesty of the hills, know the serenity of the plains, etc., etc., as all such believers do. Then, looking down the red hyacinth, the purple iris wrought her to cry out in ecstasy at the goodness, the beauty of nature. Raising her eyes again, she beheld the eagle soaring, and imagined its raptures, and made them her own. Returning home, she saluted each star, each peak, and each watchfire as if they signalled to her alone, and at last, when she flung herself upon her mat in the gypsy's tent, she could not help bursting out again. How good to eat! How good to eat! For it is a curious fact that though human beings have such imperfect means of communication that they can only say good to eat when they mean beautiful, and the other way about, they will yet endure ridicule and misunderstanding rather than keep any experience to themselves. All the young gypsies laughed, but Rustum el-Sadi, the old man who had brought Orlando out of Constantinople on his donkey, sat silent. He had a nose like a scimitar. His cheeks were furrowed as if from the age-long descent of iron hail. He was brown and keen-eyed, and as he sat tugging at his hookah, he observed Orlando narrowly. He had the deepest suspicion that her god was nature. One day he found her in tears. Interpreting this to mean that her god had punished her, he told her that he was not surprised. He showed her the fingers of his left hand, withered by the frost. He showed her his right foot, crushed where a rock had fallen. This, he said, was what her god did to men. When she said, "But so beautiful," using the English word, he shook his head, and when she repeated it, he was angry. He saw that she did not believe what he believed, and that was enough, wise and ancient as he was, to enrage him. This difference of opinion disturbed Orlando, who had been perfectly happy until now. She began to think, was nature beautiful or cruel? And then she asked herself what this beauty was, whether it was in things themselves or only in herself. So she went on to the nature of reality, which led her to truth, which in its turn led to love, friendship, poetry, as in the days on the high mound at home. Which meditations, since she could impart no word of them, made her long, as she had never longed before, for pen and ink. "Oh, if only I could write!" she cried, for she had the odd conceit of those who write that words written are shared. She had no ink, and but little paper. But she made ink from berries and wine, and finding a few margins and blank spaces in the manuscript of the oak tree, managed by writing a kind of shorthand to describe the scenery in a long, blank version poem, and to carry on a dialogue with herself about this beauty and truth concisely enough. This kept her extremely happy for hours on end, but the gypsies became suspicious. First, they noticed that she was less adept than before at milking and cheese-making. Next, she often hesitated before replying, and once a gypsy boy who had been asleep woke in a terror feeling her eyes upon him. Sometimes this constraint would be felt by the whole tribe, numbering some dozens of grown men and women. It sprang from the sense they had, and their senses are very sharp and much in advance of their vocabulary, that whatever they were doing crumbled like ashes in their hands. An old woman making a basket, a boy skinning a sheep would be singing or crooning contentedly at their work, when Orlando would come into the camp, fling herself down by the fire and gaze into the flames. She need not even look at them, and yet they felt, here is someone who doubts. We make a rough and ready translation from the gypsy language. Here is someone who does not do the thing for the sake of doing, nor looks for looking's sake. Here is someone who believes neither in sheepskin nor basket, but sees, here they looked apprehensively about the tent, something else. Then a vague but most unpleasant feeling would begin to work in the boy and in the old woman. They broke their withies, they cut their fingers. A great rage filled them. They wished Orlando would leave the tent and never come near them again. Yet she was of a cheerful and willing disposition, they owned, and one of her pearls was enough to buy the finest herd of goats in Brusa. Slowly she began to feel that there was some difference between her and the gypsies, which made her hesitate sometimes to marry and settle down among them forever. At first she tried to account for it by saying that she came of an ancient and civilized race, whereas these gypsies were an ignorant people, not much better than savages. One night when they were questioning her about England, she could not help with some pride describing the house where she was born, how it had 365 bedrooms and had been in the possession of her family for 400 or 500 years. Her ancestors were earls, or even dukes, she added. At this she noticed again that the gypsies were uneasy, but not angry as before when she had praised the beauty of nature. Now they were courteous, but concerned as people of fine breeding are when a stranger has been made to reveal his low birth or poverty. Rustum followed her out of the tent alone and said that she need not mind if her father were a duke, and possessed all the bedrooms and furniture that she described. They would none of them think the worse of her for that. Then she was seized with a shame that she had never felt before. It was clear that Rustum and the other gypsies thought a descent of 400 or 500 years only the meanest possible. Their own families went back at least 2,000 or 3,000 years, to the gypsy whose ancestors had built the pyramids centuries before Christ was born. The genealogy of Howards and Plantagenets was no better and no worse than that of the Smiths and the Joneses. Both were negligible. Moreover, where the shepherd boy had a lineage of such antiquity, there was nothing specially memorable or desirable in ancient birth. Vagabonds and beggars all shared it. And then, though he was too courteous to speak openly, it was clear that the gypsy thought that there was no more vulgar ambition than to possess bedrooms by the 100. They were on top of a hill as they spoke. It was night. The mountains rose around them. When the whole earth is ours. Looked at from the gypsy point of view, a duke, Orlando understood, was nothing but a profiteer or robber who snatched land and money from people who rated these things of little worth and could think of nothing better to do than to build 365 bedrooms when one was enough, and none was even better than one. She could not deny that her ancestors had accumulated field after field, house after house, honour after honour, yet had none of them been saints or heroes, or great benefactors of the human race. Nor could she counter the argument. Rustum was too much of a gentleman to press it, but she understood that any man who did now what her ancestors had done 300 or 400 years ago would be denounced, and by her own family most loudly, for a vulgar upstart, an adventurer, a nouveau riche. She sought to answer such arguments by the familiar if oblique method of finding the gypsy life itself rude and barbarous, and so, in a short time, much bad blood was bred between them. Indeed, such differences of opinion are enough to cause bloodshed and revolution. Towns have been sacked for less, and 1,000,000 martyrs have suffered at the stake rather than yield an inch upon any of the points here debated. No passion is stronger in the breast of man than the desire to make others believe as he believes. Nothing so cuts at the root of his happiness and fills him with rage as the sense that another rates low what he prizes high. Whigs and Tories, Liberal Party and Labour Party. For what do they battle except their own prestige? It is not love of truth, but desire to prevail that sets quarter against quarter and makes parish desire the downfall of parish. Each seeks peace of mind and subserviency rather than the triumph of truth and the exaltation of virtue. But these moralities belong and should be left to the historian, since they are as dull as ditch water. 476 bedrooms mean nothing to them, sighed Orlando. She prefers a sunset to a flock of goats, said the gypsies. What was to be done Orlando could not think. To leave the gypsies and become once more an ambassador seemed to her intolerable. But it was equally impossible to remain forever where there was neither ink nor writing paper, neither reverence for the Talbots nor respect for a multiplicity of bedrooms. So she was thinking one fine morning on the slopes of Mount Athos, when minding her goats. And then nature, in whom she trusted, either played her a trick or worked a miracle. Again, opinions differ too much for it to be possible to say which. Orlando was gazing rather disconsolately at the steep hillside in front of her. It was now midsummer, and if we must compare the landscape to anything, it would have been to a dry bone, to a sheep's skeleton, to a gigantic skull picked white by 1,000 vultures. The heat was intense, and the little fig tree under which Orlando lay only served to print patterns of fig leaves upon her light burnous. Suddenly a shadow, though there was nothing to cast a shadow, appeared on the bald mountainside opposite. It deepened quickly, and soon a green hollow showed where there had been barren rock before. As she looked, the hollow deepened and widened, and a great park-like space opened in the flank of the hill. Within, she could see an undulating and grassy lawn. She could see oak trees dotted here and there. She could see the thrushes hopping among the branches. She could see the deer stepping delicately from shade to shade, and could even hear the hum of insects and the gentle sighs and shivers of a summer's day in England. After she had gazed entranced for some time, snow began falling. Soon the whole landscape was covered and marked with violet shades instead of yellow sunlight. Now she saw heavy carts coming along the roads, laden with tree trunks, which they were taking, she knew, to be sawn for firewood. And then appeared the roofs and belfries and towers and courtyards of her own home. The snow was falling steadily, and she could now hear the slither and flop which it made as it slid down the roof and fell to the ground. The smoke went up from 1,000 chimneys. All was so clear and minute that she could see a door pecking for worms in the snow. Then, gradually, the violet shadows deepened and closed over the carts and the lawns and the great house itself. All was swallowed up. Now there was nothing left of the grassy hollow, and instead of the green lawns was only the blazing hillside which 1,000 vultures seemed to have picked bare. At this she burst into a passion of tears, and striding back to the gypsies' camp, told them that she must sail for England the very next day. It was happy for her that she did so. Already the young men had plotted her death. Honour, they said, demanded it, for she did not think as they did. Yet they would have been sorry to cut her throat, and welcomed the news of her departure. An English merchant ship, as luck would have it, was already under sail in the harbour about to return to England, and Orlando, by breaking off another pearl from her necklace, not only paid her passage but had some banknotes left over in her wallet. These she would have liked to present to the gypsies, but they despised wealth, she knew, and she had to content herself with embraces, which on her part were sincere. Chapter 4. With some of the guineas left from the sale of the 10th pearl on her string, Orlando bought herself a complete outfit of such clothes as women then wore, and it was in the dress of a young Englishwoman of rank that she now sat on the deck of the enamoured lady. It is a strange fact, but a true one, that up to this moment she had scarcely given her sex a thought. Perhaps the Turkish trousers which she had hitherto worn had done something to distract her thoughts, and the gypsy women, except in one or two important particulars, differ very little from the gypsy men. At any rate, it was not until she felt the coil of skirts about her legs, and the captain offered, with the greatest politeness, to have an awning spread for her on deck, that she realised with a start the penalties and the privileges of her position. But that start was not of the kind that might have been expected. It was not caused, that is to say, simply and solely by the thought of her chastity and how she could preserve it. In normal circumstances, a lovely young woman alone would have thought of nothing else. The whole edifice of female government is based on that foundation stone. Chastity is their jewel, their centrepiece, which they run mad to protect and die when ravished of. But if one has been a man for 30 years or so, and an ambassador into the bargain, if one has held a queen in one's arms and one or two other ladies, if report be true, of less exalted rank, if one has married a Rosina Pepita and so on, one does not perhaps give such a very great start about that. Orlando's start was of a very complicated kind, and not to be summed up in a trice. Nobody indeed ever accused her of being one of those quick wits who run to the end of things in a minute. It took her the entire length of the voyage to moralise out the meaning of her start, and so, at her own pace, we will follow her. Lord, she thought when she had recovered from her start, stretching herself out at length under her awning, this is a pleasant, lazy way of life, to be sure. But, she thought, giving her legs a kick, these skirts are plaguey things to have about one's heels. Yet the stuff, flowered paduasoy, is the loveliest in the world. Never have I seen my own skin, here she laid her hand on her knee, look to such advantage as now. Could I, however, leap overboard and swim in clothes like these? No, therefore, I should have to trust to the protection of a blue jacket. Do I object to that? Now do I? She wondered, here encountering the first knot in the smooth skein of her argument. Dinner came before she had untied it, and then it was the captain himself, Captain Nicholas Benedict Bartolus, a sea captain of distinguished aspect, who did it for her as he helped her to a slice of corned beef. "A little of the fat, ma'am?" he asked. "Let me cut you just the tiniest little slice, the size of your fingernail." At those words a delicious tremor ran through her frame. Birds sang. The torrents rushed. It recalled the feeling of indescribable pleasure with which she had first seen Sasha hundreds of years ago. Then she had pursued, now she fled. Which is the greater ecstasy, the man's or the woman's, and are they not perhaps the same? No, she thought, this is the most delicious, thanking the captain but refusing, to refuse and see him frown. Well, she would, if he wished it, have the very thinnest, smallest shiver in the world. This was the most delicious of all, to yield and see him smile. For nothing, she thought, regaining her couch on deck and continuing the argument, is more heavenly than to resist and to yield and to resist. Surely it throws the spirit into such a rapture as nothing else can, so that I'm not sure, she continued, that I won't throw myself overboard for the mere pleasure of being rescued by a blue jacket after all. It must be remembered that she was like a child entering into possession of a pleasance or toy cupboard. Her arguments would not commend themselves to mature women who have had the run of it all their lives. But what used we young fellows in the cockpit of the Marie Rose to say about a woman who threw herself overboard for the pleasure of being rescued by a blue jacket? She said. We had a word for them. Ah, I have it. But we must omit that word. It was disrespectful in the extreme and passing strange on a lady's lips. Lord, Lord, she cried again at the conclusion of her thoughts, must I then begin to respect the opinion of the other sex, however monstrous I think it? If I wear skirts, if I can't swim, if I have to be rescued by a blue jacket, by God, she cried, I must. Upon which a gloom fell over her. Candid by nature, and averse to all kinds of equivocation, to tell lies bored her. It seemed to her a roundabout way of going to work. Yet she reflected the flowered paduasoy, the pleasure of being rescued by a blue jacket. If these were only to be obtained by roundabout ways, roundabout one must go, she supposed. She remembered how, as a young man, she had insisted that women must be obedient, chaste, scented, and exquisitely apparelled. Now, I shall have to pay in my own person for those desires, she reflected, for women are not, judging by my own short experience of the sex, obedient, chaste, scented, and exquisitely apparelled by nature. They can only attain these graces without which they may enjoy none of the delights of life by the most tedious discipline. There's the hairdressing, she thought. That alone will take an hour of my morning. There's looking in the looking-glass, another hour. There's staying and lacing. There's washing and powdering. There's changing from silk to lace, and from lace to paduasoy. There's being chaste year in, year out. Here she tossed her foot impatiently, and showed an inch or two of calf. A sailor on the mast, who happened to look down at the moment, started so violently that he missed his footing and only saved himself by the skin of his teeth. If the sight of my ankles means death to an honest fellow who, no doubt, has a wife and family to support, I must, in all humanity, keep them covered, Orlando thought. Yet her legs were among her chiefest beauties, and she fell to thinking what an odd pass we have come to, when all a woman's beauty has to be kept covered lest a sailor may fall from a masthead. A pox on them, she said, realizing for the first time what, In other circumstances, she would have been taught as a child, that is to say, the sacred responsibilities of womanhood. And that's the last oath I shall ever be able to swear, she thought, once I set foot on English soil. And I shall never be able to crack a man over the head, or tell him he lies in his teeth, or draw my sword and run him through the body, or sit among my peers, or wear a coronet, or walk in procession, or sentence a man to death, or lead an army, or prance down Whitehall on a charger, or wear 72 different medals on my breast. All I can do once I set foot on English soil is to pour out tea and ask my lords how they like it. Do you take sugar? Do you take cream? And mincing out the words, she was horrified to perceive how low an opinion she was forming of the other sex, the manly, to which it had once been her pride to belong. To fall from a masthead, she thought, because you see a woman's ankles. To dress up like a Guy Fawkes and parade the streets so that women may praise you. To deny a woman teaching lest she may laugh at you. To be the slave of the frailest chit in petticoats. And yet to go about as if you were the lords of creation. Heavens, she thought, what fools they make of us. What fools we are. And here it would seem from some ambiguity in her terms that she was censuring both sexes equally, as if she belonged to neither. And indeed, for the time being, she seemed to vacillate. She was man, she was woman. She knew the secrets, shared the weaknesses of each. It was a most bewildering and whirligig state of mind to be in. The comforts of ignorance seemed utterly denied her. She was a feather blown on the gale. Thus, it is no great wonder, as she pitted one sex against the other, and found each alternately full of the most deplorable infirmities, and was not sure to which she belonged. It was no great wonder that she was about to cry out that she would return to Turkey and become a gypsy again, when the anchor fell with a great splash into the sea. The sails came tumbling on deck, and she perceived, so sunk had she been in thought that she had seen nothing for several days, that the ship was anchored off the coast of Italy. The captain at once sent to ask the honour of her company ashore with him in the longboat. When she returned the next morning, she stretched herself on her couch under the awning and arranged her draperies with the greatest decorum about her ankles. Ignorant and poor as we are compared with the other sex, she thought, continuing the sentence which she had left unfinished the other day, armoured with every weapon as they are, while they debar us even from a knowledge of the alphabet. And from these opening words it is plain that something had happened during the night to give her a push towards the female sex, for she was speaking more as a woman speaks than as a man, yet with a sort of content after all. Still, they fall from the masthead. Here she gave a great yawn and fell asleep. When she woke, the ship was sailing before a fair breeze so near the shore that towns on the cliff's edge seemed only kept from slipping into the water by the interposition of some great rock or the twisted roots of some ancient olive tree. The scent of oranges wafted from a million trees, heavy with the fruit, reached her on deck. A score of blue dolphins, twisting their tails, leapt high now and again into the air. Stretching her arms out, arms, she had learnt already, have no such fatal effects as legs, she thanked heaven that she was not prancing down Whitehall on a war-horse, nor even sentencing a man to death. Better is it, she thought, to be clothed with poverty and ignorance, which are the dark garments of the female sex. Better to leave the rule and discipline of the world to others. Better be quit of martial ambition, the love of power, and all the other manly desires if so one can more fully enjoy the most exalted raptures known to the humane spirit, which are, she said aloud, as her habit was when deeply moved, contemplation, solitude, love. Praise God that I'm a woman, she cried, and was about to run into extreme folly than which none is more distressing in woman or man either, of being proud of her sex, when she paused over the singular word, which, for all we can do to put it in its place, has crept in at the end of the last sentence. Love. Love, said Orlando. Instantly. Such is its impetuosity. Love took a human shape. Such is its pride. For where other thoughts are content to remain abstract, nothing will satisfy this one but to put on flesh and blood, mantilla and petticoats, hose and jerkin. And as all Orlando's loves had been women now, through the culpable laggardry of the human frame to adapt itself to convention, though she herself was a woman, it was still a woman she loved. And if the consciousness of being of the same sex had any effect at all, it was to quicken and deepen those feelings which she had had as a man. For now 1,000 hints and mysteries became plain to her that were then dark. Now the obscurity which divides the sexes and lets linger innumerable impurities in its gloom, was removed. And if there is anything in what the poet says about truth and beauty, this affection gained in beauty what it lost in falsity. At last, she cried, she knew Sasha as she was, and in the ardour of this discovery, and in the pursuit of all those treasures which were now revealed, she was so rapt and enchanted that it was as if a cannonball had exploded at her ear when a man's voice said, "Permit me, madam." A man's hand raised her to her feet, and the fingers of a man with a 3-masted sailing ship tattooed on the middle finger pointed to the horizon. "The cliffs of England, ma'am," said the captain, and he raised the hand which had pointed at the sky to the salute. Orlando now gave a second start, even more violent than the first. "Christ Jesus!" she cried. Happily, the sight of her native land after long absence excused both start and exclamation, or she would have been hard put to it to explain to Captain Bartolus the raging and conflicting emotions which now boiled within her. How tell him that she, who now trembled on his arm, had been a duke and an ambassador? How explain to him that she, who had been lapped like a lily in folds of paduasoy, had hacked heads off, and lain with loose women among treasure sacks in the holds of pirate ships on summer nights when the tulips were abloom and the bees buzzing off Wapping Old Stairs? Not even to herself could she explain the giant start she gave, as the resolute right hand of the sea captain indicated the cliffs of the British Islands. To refuse and to yield, she murmured, how delightful! To pursue and conquer, how august! To perceive and to reason, how sublime! Not one of these words so coupled together seemed to her wrong. Nevertheless, as the chalky cliffs loomed nearer, she felt culpable, dishonoured, unchaste, which, for one who had never given the matter a thought, was strange. Closer and closer they drew, till the samphire gatherers, hanging halfway down the cliff, were plain to the naked eye, and watching them, she felt, scampering up and down within her, like some derisive ghost, who in another instant will pick up her skirts and flaunt out of sight. Sasha the lost, Sasha the memory, whose reality she had proved just now so surprisingly. Sasha, she felt, mopping and mowing and making all sorts of disrespectful gestures towards the cliffs and the samphire gatherers. And when the sailors began chanting, "So goodbye and adieu to you, ladies of Spain," the words echoed in Orlando's sad heart. And she felt that however much landing there meant comfort, meant opulence, meant consequence and state, for she would doubtless pick up some noble prince and reign, his consort, over half Yorkshire. Still, if it meant conventionality, meant slavery, meant deceit, meant denying her love, fettering her limbs, pursing her lips, and restraining her tongue, then she would turn about with the ship and set sail once more for the gypsies. Among the hurry of these thoughts, however, there now rose, like a dome of smooth white marble, something which, whether fact or fancy, was so impressive to her fevered imagination that she settled upon it as one has seen a swarm of vibrant dragonflies alight with apparent satisfaction upon the glass bell which shelters some tender vegetable. The form of it, by the hazard of fancy, recalled that earliest, most persistent memory. The man with the big forehead in Twitchett's sitting room. The man who sat writing, or rather looking, but certainly not at her, for he never seemed to see her poised there in all her finery. Lovely boy though she must have been, she could not deny it, and whenever she thought of him, the thought spread round it, like the risen moon on turbulent waters, a sheet of silver calm. Now her hand went to her bosom, the other was still in the captain's keeping, where the pages of her poem were hidden safe. It might have been a talisman that she kept there. The distraction of sex, which hers was, and what it meant, subsided. She thought now only of the glory of poetry, and the great lines of Marlowe, Shakespeare, Ben Jonson. Milton began booming and reverberating, as if a golden clapper beat against a golden bell in the cathedral tower, which was her mind. The truth was that the image of the marble dome which her eyes had first discovered so faintly that it suggested a poet's forehead and thus started a flock of irrelevant ideas, was no figment, but a reality. And as the ship advanced down the Thames before a favouring gale, the image with all its associations gave place to the truth, and revealed itself as nothing more and nothing less than the dome of a vast cathedral rising among a fretwork of white spires.